In our last video, we talked about Miquella, the Unalloyed, so it's only natural for this video that we talk about his twin sister. But before we talk about the demigod herself, you must first know about the rot that afflicts her, the Scarlet Rot. It is a manifestation of the will of a sealed outer god, and there are legends that imply that the demigod we're about to talk about may have been the one that sealed this outer god within herself. But this is not entirely true. I believe they are just that, legends. The rot had existed long before the demigod's birth. The giant insects that we see through the underground of the lands between seem to be associated with this outer god. And before the birth of the twin prodigies, the Scarlet Rot was already a legend associated with the cycle of decay and rebirth. Although very few, like those of the Marai's house, truly believed in such a legend. But when the Scarlet Ionia first bloomed, they would then have their goddess. The Blade of Miquella, Malenia the Severed. Like her brother, Malenia is an Empyrean, born from Queen Marika the Eternal and Radagon of the Golden Order. From birth, Malenia was afflicted with the Scarlet Rot. Despite being the daughter of a god and having the full power of the Golden Order, they could do nothing to cure it. In her body, the Scarlet Rot wishes to break free and bloom her into a true goddess. While it wasn't clear when she started rotting, it may have been early in Malenia's life, as even when she was first learning the sword, she already had prosthetics on her body. Indeed, she learned the sword from a master whose blade curved like water, and his attacks imitated a dance like no other. In fact, you can wield a sword similar to that of her master, and its attacks resemble that of the waterfowl dance. That is a skill on Malenia's blade. From this master she would learn to wield her sword, but it is through her own strength that she would become undefeated. The curse she bore would attract the children of Rot. They would come to see Malenia as a prophet and a potential goddess, but she would turn away from the call of the Rot, choosing instead to protect her brother. The children of Rot would see this as abandonment, something we'll circle back to later. Unfortunately, despite her strength and perseverance to resist the Scarlet Rot, it would ultimately take her slowly, gouging her eyes and rotting body parts off. Prosthetics would be made for her body, first created by the Marai's house, who specialized in creating those due to their family being frail and sickly. The Marai's house would even come to worship Malenia in the future as their goddess of rot. Her suffering would greatly affect her brother more than her though, as Miquella could not stand the sight of her sister's suffering, which would eventually lead him to abandon the fundamentalism of the Golden Order, to find a way to cure the Scarlet Rot. Miquella would leave for the north, and Malenia would join him towards his Halligtree. It was Miquella who would gift Malenia with her current Valkyrie's prosthetics, a creation of unalloyed gold. The prosthetics would be so great that it can be used as proficiently as real body parts. Malenia would swear to her brother to be his blade, which is how she came to carry the title Blade of Miquella.
I am Malenia, Blade of Miquella. And I have never known defeat.
During the Shattering, she would also go to war, and she would claim a great rune for herself, one that should have been the most sacred of all the great runes, if not for her Scarlet Rot. The knights who followed her to battle would be the most fearsome of all the knights in the land, for to follow the goddess of Rot would mean to take the Scarlet Rot within yourself. This would lead to a slow and painful death. Putrefaction of the flesh would make the knights no longer fear death, and they would fight with wanton disregard. They would come to be known as the Clean Rot Knights. But though they were knights, their minds and bodies were barely kept stable by their consecrated armor. But on the eve of any battle, the Clean Rot Knights themselves would remain the most fearsome enemies. They would remain undefeated during the Shattering, and to clash with them would mean to clash with death itself. Malenia would conquest throughout the lands between, and through her sword skills alone, she would be undefeated during the early battles of the Shattering. She humiliated Godric the Grafted in the Battle of Limgrave, causing him to cower in fear. Perhaps a wise choice with what happened to their neighbor in Caelid. For in Caelid, she would be faced with General Radahn, the Star Scourge, who would prove to be more than her match. Their armies would clash, and the most fearsome battle of the Shattering would begin. They would meet upon the fields of Caelid. Radahn would meet her measure with gravity and strength, and they would be locked into a stalemate with their blades. Radahn was holding the stars in place, and Malenia was keeping the Scarlet Rot at bay. But Malenia would throw away her pride, her dignity, her will to resist the Scarlet Rot in order to claim victory. Instead of beating Radahn with her blade, she would embrace the rot within, bloom the flowers, and unleash the Scarlet Ionia upon Caelid. This would be the first time the Scarlet Ionia bloomed in the lands between, and it would destroy the entire region, as well as afflict Radahn with Scarlet Rot. Radahn would lose himself, his mind rotted from the inside, and his hunger insatiable. This act, however, would put Malenia to sleep, and it is only by the heroism of the legendary Clean Rot Knight Finlay that she would even be able to return to the Halligtree. Malenia would claim victory for this battle, because most of Radahn's army would succumb to the rot, and Radahn would cease to be himself. Despite this, the remainder of his army would continue their battle in Redmane Castle, using fire to burn away the rot, and Radahn would be left to wander the Scarlet Desert, nothing but a husk of his former self. From this point forward, Malenia would be asleep next to the roots of the Halligtree, until a certain Tarnished, destined to be Elden Lord, would wake her. The blooming of the Scarlet Ionia would echo throughout the lands between, and would cause chaos within Caelid. From here, the children of Rot would come out from their dens beneath the earth, and would celebrate the birth of their goddess, thus becoming the Order of Rot. We talked about the legend of the Scarlet Rot at the start of the video. The legend itself was a reality, and the Order of Rot long existed before Malenia's bloom. And while they didn't think of Malenia as their goddess from the start, due to her abandon, after she bloomed, she proved her beauty. This next part is a bit more open to speculation, but I believe that Gowry would come to create children using the Scarlet Ionia, and the so-called children of Malenia are not truly hers, and instead are but a cheap copy created by the children of Rot, or Gowry specifically. 4 sisters would be created before perfection could be attained. Milicent would be the perfected daughter of Gowry. She would walk the same path as Malenia and suffer all the same. But, unlike Malenia, Milicent would not be able to withstand the Scarlet Rot. It would put her in agony, unable to make her journey. It is at this moment Gowry would seek your help to obtain one of Miquella's unalloyed needles. The needle would help Milicent and enable her to follow the footsteps of Malenia, albeit with a lot of help from the Tarnished. We would help her along the way to the Halligtree. A few sequences stick out during this quest, such as Gowry's mention of Milicent being a bud that would bloom into a flower, and that her sisters before her were all inferior in quality. And Milicent talking about what she needs to return to Malenia. Her pride. To me, this shows that Malenia knew not to bloom the flowers, to keep her pride as a warrior. but in order to remain undefeated, to perhaps have a sense of usefulness despite her ailing body, or even something darker, she would cast away the needle and needless things such as pride for the sake of her dearest Miquella. The Order of Rot would join Miquella's Halligtree, and it would seem that despite their difference, they would find friendship within the covenant of the twin prodigies. And once we arrived to the Halligtree with Milicent, she would come to understand what her journey was for. It was the call of the Scarlet Rot, for her to bloom as a Scarlet Valkyrie. But just like her mother, she would reject this call, and would instead face her sisters close to the roots of the Halligtree. We would have a choice to help her or betray her, and after helping her defeat her 4 sisters, she would show the effects of the rot, for she had removed the tainted, befouled needle that was given to her. She understood that she was being led astray, to become different from who she was, to die and bloom as rot. Instead, she chose to die as herself, as who she believed herself to be, as Milicent. She would give the needle to you, now clear of any taint. She asks that you return the needle to Malenia, as she is taken by the Scarlet Rot. Eventually, the Tarnished would reach the slumbering demigod at the roots of the Halligtree. We find Malenia still asleep. Before we could even approach, a gust of wind that may have been Miquella would wake her, ready for battle. An ideal time to look at her closely. Her left arm seems to be embedded with analloyed gold to prevent it from rotting further. Her right arm completely removed, her eyes completely rotted, and both her legs rotted off as well. As the great Tarnished that you are, you would prove to be more than a match for her, and once again, she would be forced to bloom. She would release the Scarlet Ionia upon you, her form forever changed as she approaches godhood once more. But even then, the Tarnished will not be overturned. Even though you are a Tarnished of no renown, your blade is hardened and strong, and through the sheer unimaginable skill of the Tarnished destined to be Elden Lord that you are, you would claim victory in the face of the undefeated. Her passing would leave behind the flower of Scarlet Rot, and you may return the needle Milicent gave you, and here obtain the near-perfect needle of Miquella. Returning to Gowry, we'll have him lament over Milicent's death, failing to bloom as a scarlet flower. However, should you have chosen to betray Milicent, should you have strayed from the path and delivered unto her the defeat Gowry wanted, she would have bloomed into a scarlet flower like no other. Much like the flower now that sits in the roots of the Halligtree. Perhaps there is a reason why Malenia aspired to be undefeated. The Scarlet Rot is a cycle of decay and rebirth. With death as a part of that cycle, do we truly realize what we may have done?